Thanks very much for staying with us. Time now for Eye on Africa with me, Georgia Calvin-Smith. Tonight, people in Ethiopia's ethnic Sidama region vote in a referendum that could carve out a new federal state in a nation already struggling with sometimes violent inter-community tensions. Also, police break up an opposition rally in Zimbabwe as frustrations over the stalled economy grow. We hear from our correspondent in the country. And we hear from a researcher who's recently returned from the Sahel to take a closer look at the effects that deepening insecurity has had on food shortages amongst the growing number of displaced. But first, voters in Ethiopia's south turned out for a referendum that could create a new federal state. The ethnic Sidama group has long wanted to form its own home. However, there are fears that Wednesday's vote could spark inter-community violence as other groups also push for autonomy. Lambert Sheka has more.
The sun hadn't yet risen on the city of Hawassa that long queues were already forming outside polling stations. A massive turnout that showcased the historic importance of this referendum for the Sidama people.
I came here at 2 a.m. in order to cast my vote early. This is a day we've all been waiting for. It's like when a woman waits for the day she will give birth.
Ethiopia is currently partitioned into 9 semi-autonomous regions, which are largely divided along tribal lines. But despite being the country's 5th largest ethnic group, the Sidama do not have their own state. For years, they've called for the creation of a 10th region, which would grant them their own budget, the ability to collect taxes, and to change the official language. A first referendum on the issue was postponed in July, sparking violent clashes in which dozens of people were killed. On Wednesday, there was a sense among voters that their decades-long struggle was finally coming to an end.
The Sidama people have been fighting for this day for 100 years. Most of them lost their lives, and others were imprisoned. Today, I've seen this struggle bear fruit.
Since Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed took office last year, Ethiopia has seen an upswing in separatist tendencies. Critics fear that Wednesday's referendum will encourage the more than 80 ethnic groups scattered across the country to push for more autonomy. At least 10 other groups and tribes have already launched self-determination procedures similar to that of the Sidama.
Now, Zimbabwe's main opposition parties accused police of brutality after tear gas and batons were used to break up a gathering of Movement for Democratic Change supporters in Harare. Now, crowds had been waiting to hear a speech from their leader, Nelson Chamisa. Several people were injured. About 8 others were reportedly taken into custody, including a mother and her 10-month-old baby. Other victims say that they were taken by surprise by the violence.
Arriving there to meet all my colleagues. Then that was the time they started attacking and they attacked me. I was just standing over there at the robots.
The crackdown came despite a new law that was signed by President Emerson Mnangagwa last week that's supposed to guarantee Zimbabweans' right to demonstrate. Many of Mnangagwa's critics say that he's done little to change either the state of the economy or the repression of the regime of his predecessor, Robert Mugabe. Ryan Truscott joins us now with more. Ryan, were the police being heavy-handed? Why did they break up Wednesday's rally?
Well, the beatings really started when Nelson Chamisa arrived at his party headquarters and the crowd surged, and that's when the police used their batons and tear gas. The MDC had initially planned to hold the gathering at Africa Unity Square near to Parliament, but the police said that it couldn't go ahead. They said that even given the economic hardships, the event could be hijacked by agitated citizens. Those were their words. And the MDC then changed its venue and told supporters that Nelson Chamisa would address them at their party headquarters, but the police cordoned off the roads leading to the building and said that people couldn't stay in the street, that they had to go inside. And of course, that didn't happen. At least 8 people were detained, as you mentioned, including a mother with a 10-month-old baby. And among those assaulted were 3 journalists.
So what did Chamisa have to say in the end?
Well, he didn't get to address gathered supporters as hoped. He had to actually address them via social media. But he did say that the country was undergoing a soft genocide because hospitals are still closed. People are living on just one meal a day. He also said that former President Robert Mugabe was, as he put it, looking like a small boy in terms of a dictatorship compared to the current government. So it was a defiant speech, and it comes amid this growing frustration here by ordinary Zimbabweans over food and fuel and cash shortages and rising prices. And ironically, today's crackdown comes after President Mnangagwa, as you said, has signed a new security law last week. It's known by its acronym MOPA, and that's supposed to entrench people's right to demonstrate. It's been framed by the government as a key political reform that should help it re-engage with Western nations. But Britain's Africa Director Harriet Matthews said in a tweet today that the heavy-handed response by the Zimbabwean police was of concern. So these kinds of scenes that we saw today just don't help Zimbabwe's cause.
Thanks very much. Ryan Truscott there for us in Harare. Meanwhile, the hearing of a jailed Tanzanian journalist was postponed for the 8th time on Wednesday. Eric Kabendera was arrested in Dar es Salaam in July and later charged with leading organised crime, tax evasion and money laundering, all charges that he's denied. His lawyers say that he's being politically targeted and accused President John Magufuli of trying to sidestep press freedoms. And on Wednesday, Mali held a funeral for the 30 soldiers killed on Monday in an attack in Tabancourt in Gao. It was the third major strike against national forces by jihadist groups in the last 2 months. Islamic State-linked extremists claimed responsibility for the fatal ambush. It happened as soldiers from Mali and Niger were on a joint operation to track armed militants. On Wednesday, women took to the streets in Gao and Sikasso in the south to demand better protection for troops. Now, on Wednesday, France criticised Saudi Arabia for not honouring commitments made almost 2 years ago to provide about 100 million euros to the G5 Sahel force that's trying to tackle extremism across the Sahel. Militants linked to Al-Qaeda and Islamic State have ramped up attacks against various communities in the region, and the instability has hit Mali, Niger and Burkina Faso particularly hard. The UN this week has warned of a food crisis that's left about 2.4 million people unsure of where their next meal's coming from. The scale of the crisis has been described as staggering. Marwa Awad from the World Food Programme joins me now with more. Marwa, first of all, looking at the instability in the region, why have things gone so bad so quickly?
Well, those three countries that you mentioned, Burkina Faso, Mali and Niger, have been struggling over time with chronic problems of climate change and food insecurity and malnutrition. But the past 6 months, we saw a confluence of these factors in addition to an escalation in violence. And all of these factors or ingredients have come together to make this region and the Sahel a haven for armed conflict, which is leading to an escalation in displacement. Specifically in Burkina Faso, there's about 500,000 people who've left their homes running for their lives, escaping the northern part where most of the armed conflict is, and moving down to the south where they're being met by humanitarians, and we are supporting many of them right now.
Now, you this week have raised the alarm about the scale of the food crisis that's kind of emerged from all of these various factors that you've just mentioned. Do you feel, you've just come from Burkina Faso yourself, in fact, do you feel that that the communities that you've encountered amongst the displaced are themselves aware of the scale of the food crisis that they are suffering from?
Well, certainly not the scale, but on an individual basis, every person I met was telling me that food was essential, that they want food over anything. One person said, food is our number one priority. Give me food and I don't want clothes. Other families also wanted the same. However, there seemed to be a lack of awareness and a total shock of what's happening to them. The Burkinabe people are very gentle, and they're not used to in their history of such events, such as armed conflict at this scale that we're seeing now. So certainly they were at a loss for why this is happening. Many of them wanted to go back. But there is also the problem of malnutrition. And one family, one mother that I met, unfortunately, she had a child who had a swollen belly, so it was clearly malnourished, but she didn't know it was malnourishment. I asked her, do you feel your child is sick? Why does he have a big belly? And she simply said, I think he's just eating too much. He's a little bit fat. So it's quite concerning, and that's why internationally people have to come together, because the Sahel area is bound to be a ticking bomb if no help is given it.
So it must be particularly difficult to respond in places like Burkina Faso, who in just 4 years, has suddenly had to deal with this rapidly escalating crisis, because I think it was just January 2016 that they saw their first large-scale terror attack. What do you want to see happen in terms of responding to this crisis that's unfurling in the region?
Well, look, there must be a comprehensive response, a response that tackles the imminent threat of violent attacks and deaths and displacement, but also the long-term response that looks at that web of structural reform that needs to be done, because Burkina Faso and Niger and Mali are suffering from lack of basic services, communities that are on the peripheries and that are not really their needs are not being addressed. The World Food Programme and other agencies are on the ground. We've been on the ground looking after the humanitarian response even before that recent crisis happened. We've had programs that aim to increase the number of schools going, the number of children going to school. We've also had programs, and we still run nutrition clinics to raise awareness among mothers and families of what nutrition is. And we've had the regular food assistance being given out on a monthly basis, but more really has to happen, especially a more concerted effort by international community, by governments with influence over the region to step up their aid and their assistance.
Thanks very much. Marwa Awad there from the World Food Programme, pointing out the deepening crisis in the Sahel caused by a confluence of factors including climate change and escalating militant extremist violence. Well, that is, though, all we have time for now for Eye on Africa. Thanks very much for joining us. Do so again if you can. Take care.